For most of human history, power was defined by land. Empires expanded by conquering territory. Armies moved borders. Maps changed color. If a nation wanted to dominate, it took land from someone else. But that logic no longer explains how the modern world actually works. Today, countries don't collapse because their borders disappear. They collapse when their economies stop moving. Modern power is no longer about what a nation owns. It's about what it controls. A look at a political map, and you see countries and borders. But look at how the world truly functions, and you see something else entirely. You see movement, invisible flows carrying food, energy, medicine, and goods across the planet every single day. Almost everything that sustains modern life moves through a very small number of maritime routes, and when those routes are disrupted, the effects are immediate. No invasion is necessary. No capital needs to fall. A delay is enough. A blockage is enough. A disruption is enough. That is why the next major global conflict will not be fought over territory. It will be fought over movement, over logistics, over routes, over control. Once you understand that, the world map stops being static. It becomes a system, and systems can be controlled. Modern life feels complex, decentralized, and resilient. But underneath that appearance, the global economy runs on a system that is far more fragile than most people realize. According to the UNCTAD, roughly 90% of global trade is transported by sea. That includes food, energy, raw materials, medical supplies, and nearly every manufactured product used in daily life. The modern world does not move on land. It moves on water. Every smartphone, every vehicle, every power grid, and every supermarket shelf depends on cargo ships crossing oceans on precise schedules. And those schedules leave very little room for error, because global trade does not move freely across all oceans in equal measure. It moves through concentrated corridors. A small number of maritime routes carry a disproportionate share of global economic activity. These routes are efficient, but they are also narrow, predictable, and exposed. Energy is the clearest example. Approximately 1/3 of the world's seaborne oil trade passes through the Strait of Hormuz. That means a single maritime passage, only a few dozen kilometers wide at its narrowest point, influences fuel prices on every continent. Even when no ships are blocked, the mere threat of disruption in Hormuz has historically caused oil prices to spike within hours. Markets react not to events, but to vulnerability. Manufactured goods show the same pattern. Around 12% of global trade flows through the Suez Canal, connecting factories in Asia with consumers and industries in Europe. Electronics, machinery, pharmaceuticals, vehicle components, all of them rely on uninterrupted transit through this single corridor. There is no realistic global alternative that can absorb that volume at short notice. Food systems are no different. Grains, fertilizers, and agricultural inputs depend heavily on maritime shipping. Many countries no longer maintain large strategic reserves. They depend on continuous delivery. A delay of days can become a shortage. A shortage can become a political crisis. This is why modern supply chains were built around just-in-time logistics, companies optimized for speed, cost reduction, and efficiency. Warehouses were minimized. Redundancy was removed. Margins were tightened. From a business perspective, the system worked. From a strategic perspective, it created a structural weakness, because when supply chains stretch across continents, they become sensitive to even minor disruptions. A single delay can ripple outward. A ship arrives late. Factories pause production. Inventories run dry. Prices rise. Public pressure follows. And crucially, none of this requires military occupation. No territory has to be seized. No government has to fall. The pressure is applied indirectly, through movement. This is what makes modern economic power fundamentally different from historical power. In the past, control meant ownership. You ruled what you physically held. Today, control means access. Access to routes, access to timing, access to flow. This is why disruptions in maritime corridors consistently produce global consequences that far exceed their geographic scale. A narrow strait, a single canal, a limited passage. Small places carrying enormous weight. And once you recognize how concentrated these corridors truly are, a larger pattern begins to emerge. The global economy is not just interconnected, it is exposed. And systems built on exposure do not need to be conquered. They only need to be interrupted. The global economy depends on a handful of maritime corridors. They are not interchangeable, they are not redundant, and they are not equally protected. Each one concentrates an outsized amount of global trade into a narrow geographic space. When something happens in one of these corridors, the effects travel far beyond the region itself. Let's look at 4 of them. The Red Sea, pressure without war. The Red Sea is one of the most critical maritime passages on Earth. It connects Asia to Europe through the Suez Canal, making it an essential artery for global trade. In late 2023 and early 2024, attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea forced some of the world's largest shipping companies to change course. Companies like Maersk, MSC, and Hapag-Lloyd temporarily rerouted vessels around the Cape of Good Hope. That detour added 10 to 14 days to each journey. No ports were occupied, no territory changed hands, yet the impact was immediate. Shipping costs rose, insurance premiums spiked, delivery times stretched. A regional disruption created global friction. The key lesson was not the attacks themselves. It was how little force was required to alter global trade behavior. The Suez Canal. One ship, global shock. The Suez Canal is only 193 kilometers long, but it carries roughly 12% of global trade. In March 2021, a single container ship, the Ever Given, ran aground and blocked the canal. For 6 days, more than 400 ships were trapped. The estimated economic impact reached $9 to $10 billion per day. Factories thousands of kilometers away were affected, supply chains stalled, markets reacted. This was not sabotage, it was an accident. And yet it demonstrated something critical. The global economy does not require sustained disruption to feel pain. It only requires interruption. The Panama Canal, climate as a strategic variable. The Panama Canal connects the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and handles around 6% of global trade. Unlike Suez, Panama faces a different kind of vulnerability. Water. In 2023 and 2024, a severe drought reduced water levels in the canal's freshwater locks. Authorities were forced to limit daily ship crossings. Transit capacity dropped by nearly 50% at its lowest point. The consequences were immediate. Shipping delays increased, costs rose. Agricultural exports, energy shipments, and manufactured goods were all affected. This was not conflict, it was climate stress. But the effect was identical to strategic disruption. The canal became a bottleneck, and the global system absorbed the shock. The Strait of Hormuz, power through threat alone. The Strait of Hormuz is the most sensitive energy corridor in the world. Roughly 1/3 of the world's seaborne oil trade passes through this narrow strait. For decades, Iran has periodically threatened to restrict or close Hormuz during moments of regional tension. Not once has the strait been fully closed. It hasn't needed to be. Every threat alone has been enough to push oil prices higher. Markets understand the vulnerability. The mere possibility of disruption creates leverage. This is power without action. The pattern. These four corridors differ in geography, politics, and causes of disruption, but the outcome is always the same. Small geographic points, massive global impact. No formal declaration of war, no occupation required. The system reacts automatically. Trade reroutes, prices rise, pressure spreads, and crucially, these events reveal something deeper. Global trade routes are no longer just infrastructure, they are strategic assets, and like all strategic assets, they can be influenced, pressured, and weaponized. What makes this even more significant is that none of these disruptions were coordinated. They didn't need to be. Because once the system is exposed, it responds the same way every time, which leads to a more uncomfortable question. What happens when these routes are disrupted deliberately, not accidentally, not indirectly, but as a strategy? When a major trade route fails, the damage does not stay local. It spreads. Modern supply chains are tightly synchronized systems. They depend on timing, predictability, and continuous movement. When that movement is interrupted, the system does not slow down smoothly. It breaks in stages. Stage 1: delay. The first effect is almost invisible. A ship does not arrive on schedule. A canal crossing is postponed. A route is rerouted. At this stage, nothing looks dramatic, but global logistics runs on precision. A delay of hours compounds into days. A delay of days becomes weeks. Shipping schedules are rewritten. Ports become congested. Containers pile up in the wrong places. This is where costs quietly begin to rise. Stage 2: cost. Once delays spread, costs follow immediately. Fuel expenses increase as ships take longer routes. Insurance premiums rise as risk perception changes. Charter rates spike as available vessels become scarce. After disruptions in the Red Sea, maritime insurance premiums in the region increased several times over within weeks. None of this shows up on shelves yet, but companies are already paying more to move the same goods, and those costs do not disappear. They move forward. Stage 3: shortage. As delays and costs accumulate, availability begins to change. Factories that rely on just-in-time delivery slow production. Retailers receive fewer goods than planned. Agricultural inputs arrive late, missing seasonal windows. Because inventories were minimized for efficiency, there is little buffer. A missing component can halt an entire production line. At this stage, supply chains no longer absorb shocks. They transmit them. Stage 4: inflation. Shortages translate into prices, not gradually, abruptly. Transportation costs are embedded into final prices across multiple sectors. Food becomes more expensive. Energy costs rise. Manufactured goods follow. Inflation accelerates without any change in domestic monetary policy. Governments respond, but their tools are limited. Interest rates cannot fix a blocked canal. Subsidies cannot create missing supply. The pressure is external. Stage 5: political pressure. As prices rise and availability falls, the problem stops being economic. It becomes political. Public frustration increases. Protests emerge. Governments face pressure to act against problems they cannot directly control. This is where trade disruptions begin influencing elections, alliances, and foreign policy decisions. And still, no territory has been invaded. A critical reality. What makes this domino effect so powerful is its asymmetry. The cost of causing disruption is low. The cost of absorbing disruption is high. A single incident in a narrow corridor can create cascading effects across continents. The global economy reacts automatically. Markets adjust before governments do. Prices move faster than policy. Pressure builds faster than solutions. This imbalance is what turns logistics into leverage. Why this keeps happening? Global trade was optimized for efficiency, not resilience. Supply chains became longer, production became concentrated. Alternatives disappeared. The system assumed stability. When stability breaks, the reaction is not proportional. It is exponential. The strategic implication. At this point, something becomes clear. Disrupting a route does not need to collapse the system. It only needs to apply pressure. Pressure on prices, pressure on governments, pressure on societies, and pressure, when sustained, shapes decisions. This is why trade routes are no longer passive infrastructure. They are instruments. They shape outcomes without firing a shot. If disruption alone can generate this level of global pressure, then the next question is unavoidable. What happens when disruption is no longer accidental? What happens when it becomes intentional? At this point, it's tempting to describe recent disruptions as chaos, accidents, local conflicts, unrelated crises, but that interpretation misses what is actually happening because chaos is unpredictable. What we are seeing is not. It follows a logic, and that logic has been studied, documented, and refined for years. From warfare to leverage. Traditional warfare is expensive. It requires armies, logistics, occupation, and long-term political costs. Modern states understand this, so instead of asking how to conquer territory, they ask a different question. How can pressure be applied without triggering full-scale war? The answer increasingly lies in indirect control. Control over energy flows, control over trade routes, control over timing and access. This is where strategy replaces chaos. The doctrine behind it. In military and strategic circles, this approach is often described as gray zone conflict or hybrid warfare. It operates below the threshold of declared war. No formal invasion, no official escalation, no clear moment that justifies total retaliation. Yet the effects are real. Economic pressure, political instability, strategic leverage. Documents published by the Pentagon after 2018 increasingly emphasize this shift. The focus moves away from direct confrontation and towards systems disruption. Logistics is no longer support. It is a battlefield. Why routes are perfect targets? Trade routes offer three strategic advantages. First, they are predictable. Shipping lanes do not change easily. Ports and canals cannot be relocated overnight. Second, they are asymmetric. It takes enormous resources to protect them fully. It takes relatively little effort to disrupt them. Third, they affect everyone. Pressure applied at a choke point does not stay regional. It spreads globally. This makes maritime corridors ideal instruments of coercion, not because they collapse economies instantly, but because they apply continuous, distributed pressure. State and non-state actors learn the same lesson. This strategy is not limited to major powers. Smaller states and non-state actors study the same vulnerabilities. They understand that. They do not need to win militarily. They do not need territorial control. They only need to alter risk calculations. A few incidents are enough. Insurance markets react, shipping companies reroute, governments feel pressure from voters and businesses. The leverage multiplies. Infrastructure as power. China provides a different illustration of this logic. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, Beijing has invested heavily in ports, railways, and logistics hubs across Asia, Africa, and Europe. These investments are often framed as economic development, but strategically they also shape access. Who controls ports influences routes. Who influences routes influences trade. Who influences trade gains leverage. This is power exercised structurally, not militarily. Energy and strategic pressure. Russia offers another example. Rather than relying on conventional military dominance alone, Moscow has repeatedly used energy flows as a political instrument. gas pipelines, supply contracts, pricing pressure. Energy routes function the same way as shipping lanes. They create dependence, and dependence creates leverage. The key insight. What ties all of this together is intention. These disruptions are not random. They are tolerated, encouraged, or exploited because they produce results. They raise costs without provoking immediate retaliation. They influence decisions without crossing red lines. They reshape behavior quietly. This is strategy adapted to a globalized world. Why this is hard to respond to? Traditional deterrence struggles here. You cannot retaliate against an accident. You cannot sanction a drought. You cannot declare war over insurance premiums. And because there is no single moment of escalation, responses are delayed. Meanwhile, pressure accumulates. The system absorbs it until it can't. The strategic shift. This is the critical transformation. Power is no longer measured only by territory, population, or firepower. It is measured by influence over systems, trade systems, energy systems, logistics systems. And systems do not need to be destroyed. They only need to be controlled. Once disruption becomes strategy, one final line is crossed. Conflict no longer needs declarations. It doesn't need armies on borders. It simply operates, quietly, continuously, effectively, which raises the next question. If this is war, why does it never get declared? At some point, the distinction becomes unavoidable. What we are describing looks like war. It produces damage. It creates pressure. It reshapes political decisions. Yet no one calls it war, because it doesn't follow the rules we associate with conflict. There are no declarations, no formal fronts, no clear beginning, and that is precisely why it works. Traditional wars relied on clarity, two sides, a starting moment, a visible escalation. Declarations mattered because they triggered responses, alliances activated, treaties applied, rules of engagement became clear. But in a globalized economy, that clarity is a liability. Declaring war today comes with immediate costs: sanctions, market panic, diplomatic isolation. So modern conflict adapts. Instead of announcing itself, it blends into normality. Shipping delays look like logistics problems. Energy shortages look like market fluctuations. Price spikes look like inflation. Each event has a plausible explanation. Together, they create pressure without attribution. Plausible deniability as a weapon. This model relies on ambiguity. Was the disruption intentional or accidental? Was it strategic or coincidental? Was it political or technical? As long as these questions remain unanswered, retaliation is difficult. Governments hesitate. Markets adjust. Pressure accumulates. This is conflict without fingerprints. Legal and political gray zones. International law was designed for territorial conflict. Borders crossed, forces deployed, sovereignty violated. But what happens when no border is crossed? When a route is delayed instead of blocked? When pressure is applied through risk rather than force? There is no clear legal threshold. Institutions struggle to respond because nothing officially happened, and that gap becomes operational space. Why this model is attractive? This form of conflict offers three advantages. First, it is cheap. Disruption costs far less than invasion. Second, it is scalable. Pressure can be increased or reduced gradually. Third, it is deniable. There is no single act that justifies full retaliation. For states facing stronger opponents, this is especially appealing. It levels the field. When economics replaces battlefields. In this model, economic indicators become the scoreboard. Inflation replaces casualties. Supply shortages replace territorial losses. Public dissatisfaction replaces military defeat. The battlefield is not land, it is confidence. Confidence in markets, confidence in governments, confidence in stability. Once that confidence erodes, political consequences follow. The strategic shift in response. Governments still prepare for traditional war. They invest in defense. They reinforce borders. They build deterrence. But these tools are blunt against invisible pressure. You cannot deploy troops to reopen a canal. You cannot deter a shipping reroute. You cannot sanction a delay. This creates a structural mismatch, old tools facing new forms of conflict. The core reality. War no longer announces itself. It doesn't arrive with troops, it arrives with spreadsheets, with shipping data, with insurance rates, with price indexes. By the time leaders recognize the pressure as conflict, it has already done its work. If war no longer needs declarations, then escalation no longer looks like escalation. It looks like normalization, which leads to the final, unavoidable question. If this model is cheaper, quieter, and more effective, why would anyone go back? At this point, it's natural to ask whether this is temporary, whether recent disruptions are just part of a turbulent phase that will eventually stabilize. History suggests otherwise, because the forces driving this shift are structural, and structural changes don't reverse easily. Global trade is more concentrated, not less. Over the past decades, global trade did not diversify. It concentrated. Manufacturing clustered in fewer regions. Critical components became dependent on single suppliers. Shipping volumes increased faster than route capacity. Efficiency demanded scale. Scale demanded concentration, and concentration created choke points. Even efforts to reshore or friend-shore production do not eliminate this reality. They often shift dependence from one corridor to another. The system remains exposed. Resilience costs more than efficiency. For years, markets rewarded efficiency above all else. Lean inventories, minimal redundancy, just-in-time delivery. Resilience, by contrast, is expensive. It requires spare capacity, multiple routes, idle infrastructure. Those costs reduce margins. And in competitive global markets, reduced margins are punished. This creates a paradox. Everyone wants resilience. Few are willing to pay for it. So the system continues to optimize for speed, not safety. Climate adds a new layer of instability. Climate stress does not replace strategy. It amplifies it. Droughts affect canals. Storms disrupt ports. Heat impacts infrastructure reliability. These events are not predictable in timing, but they are predictable in frequency, which means volatility becomes normal. And volatility creates opportunity for pressure. What once looked like force majeure now becomes a recurring variable. The barriers to entry are low. Perhaps the most destabilizing factor is accessibility. You do not need a navy to influence shipping behavior. You do not need territorial control to raise insurance costs. You need presence. You need proximity. You need credibility. This lowers the threshold for participation. More actors can apply pressure. More actors can shape outcomes. And as more players adopt this logic, normalization follows. Responses are always reactive. Defensive measures lag behind disruption. Shipping adapts after routes are threatened. Governments respond after prices rise. Institutions reform after pressure becomes visible. By the time countermeasures are implemented, behavior has already changed. Markets have already adjusted. The system absorbs disruption first. Correction comes later. There is no clear end state. Traditional wars end. Treaties are signed. Borders are redrawn. Hostilities stop. This model has no equivalent conclusion. Pressure can be reduced without resolution. Disruption can pause without agreement. There is no victory moment, only management. This makes the system persistent rather than episodic. The long-term consequence. Taken together, These forces point in one direction, not collapse, normalization. A world where disruption is expected, where rerouting is routine, where pressure replaces confrontation. In that world, power belongs less to those who control territory and more to those who influence systems. The final reality. This is not a transition phase, it is a redefinition. The global economy has crossed a threshold where stability is no longer assumed, and once that assumption disappears, behavior changes permanently. Companies adapt, governments adjust, strategies evolve, not toward peace but toward managed instability. If this is the direction of modern conflict, if pressure replaces invasion, and if systems matter more than land, then the most important question is no longer who owns territory, it is who controls the routes that keep the world moving. For most of modern history, we were taught to look at the world as a collection of countries, borders, flags, territory. That map still matters, but it no longer explains power, because the forces shaping the world today do not move across borders. They move through systems, through routes, through timing, through access. The global economy no longer depends on who owns land, it depends on who controls movement. And that control rarely looks dramatic. It doesn't arrive with armies, it doesn't announce itself, it shows up as delays, as shortages, as rising prices. It shows up quietly until it doesn't. Once you understand this, recent events stop looking disconnected. Shipping disruptions, energy pressure, supply chain crises. They are not anomalies, they are signals. Signals that power has shifted away from territory and toward infrastructure, away from conquest and toward leverage. The most important places on Earth are no longer capitals. They are narrow passages, canals, straits, routes that almost no one sees, but everyone depends on. And those routes don't need to be captured, they only need to be influenced. This is why the next global conflict won't look like the last one. It won't be declared, it won't be symmetrical, and it won't end with a treaty. It will operate continuously through pressure rather than force. So the next time you look at a world map, ask a different question. Not who owns what, but who controls the flow. Because in a world built on movement, that is where real power lives.